Welcome back to Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance. I am Chandler Fleming, owner and lead therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling here in Clarkston, Michigan.
And I am Victoria Fleming, owner and therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling as well.
And just want to say welcome back to the show. And if you have any questions, especially things that you might want to be answered on the show, please refer to our Facebook page, Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance, or shoot us an email. We'd be glad to take up some of your questions and do our best to answer them for you.
Yeah, discuss them on the show for sure. Today, we are going to discuss communication. It's a very important topic, one that we've a little bit touched on in other episodes, but today we want to touch on it even more fully. Communication skills and the importance thereof.
Yeah, so this is a topic that we covered a little bit when we went over relationship skills, but wanted to cover it again. Mm-hmm. And if you feel free to look up online on YouTube to see the video again. But today we're going to talk about communication, some of the nuts and bolts, and how it applies to other relationships besides those personal relationships.
Right, and there are a couple of aspects of communication. We've got the verbal part of communication, which is the actual words that we speak and that we use. And then we have the nonverbal communication. Chandler, as we look at those two components, the verbal and the nonverbal, what are we looking at percentage-wise? How much is communicated by verbal versus nonverbal?
You know, it's kind of interesting. I think some of it depends on the message. When I read literature on communication, it really says anywhere from 35 to 70% of the message is the nonverbal. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily the words that you use, but it's those other things that make up that message. And a lot of communication takes place with no words being exchanged at all.
Right, so when we're looking at the nonverbal, there are several components to the nonverbal. We are looking at the tone, the volume, the pace, the stance or posture, stance and posture of a person,
right.
And then the gestures. You know, like I'm a big one for gestures. I know I've been teased, my sisters and I, that if we were ever kidnapped and our hands were tied behind our back, we'd never be able to get our message videoed.
Yeah, that's true.
So, but gestures is one of them.
Oh, sure.
So, as you look at that, what is it that happens to a person when they're saying their words, but then those nonverbals are being used? How does it impact it?
You know, I think it impacts it a ton. I think it's really important for people to recognize their posture. I think on the other show that we talked about communication, I talked about being the blowfish, and the message that I sent, you know, I kind of inflated my chest and tried to look really, really important and intimidating. That message was not welcoming. So no matter how my tone was, however the pace that I used or the volume, the message would be confused. And, you know, a lot of times I see people in session, like they're talking to their spouse, or even out in the community, their posture and their gestures are threatening or dismissive, or things that they don't even really recognize that they're doing. So it's pretty important.
Right, absolutely. Communication, as we said, is vitally important. So it's super important that we do start breaking down what we're communicating through those nonverbals. I know we have this example of if we said, you need help?
Yeah.
And we are looking at how you need help could be communicated in three very distinct ways. It could come across as a question,
Yeah.
You need help?
You need help?
Yeah, absolutely. It could come across as a criticism or a statement, an emphatic statement, you need help.
Right, with a certain negative message to it, some disdain in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then we are also saying that it could just be a suggestion.
Or it's just a kind of a statement of fact. You know, you need help. Is much different than kind of implying something like, a lot of times when somebody says you need help, I think they're implying psychiatric help or psychological help. So it could just be, hey, you need help. It could be just a statement of fact.
Right, especially if you saw someone struggling with a heavy package. It could just be, you need help, or it could be a question, you need help? So obviously with those, the tone is extremely important because
Sure.
it does convey the possibility of a question. It could be a suggestion, but then it could also be a criticism or an attack, which is an important thing to recognize. So just recognize with that single thing, you need help. I know I've often in conversations with friends talked about how sorry can take on such a different meaning, based on the tone.
Oh, sure.
So especially with our kids, yes.
Yeah. My kids are very good at saying sorry. It doesn't seem like they're sorry, but so that I guess I need to coach them on their tone and their delivery of that message.
So, okay, so what are some other examples where that verbal and the nonverbal, connecting them and making that communication more effective?
I think there's a lot of different examples of how we need to take a look at it, but I think part two of that is just listening for meaning. And it's very important to kind of listen to what does that person mean in what they're trying to say. So the example I put up was a boss says to an employee, "You're always late." And the employee says back, "I was on time yesterday." Well, literally always means always, but he missed the message. The message was that his amount of lateness was more than what the boss appreciated. The other example I used is the coworker says, "Can you help me with this? It's too heavy." And the second coworker says, "It's not heavier than the other two." Again, you're missing the message. And I oftentimes see this in a lot of relationships. And men tend to be more prone to it, where they make the mistake of really listening to those literal words, and they totally miss the meaning. So a lot of times you have to ask yourself, what does this person mean? What are they really trying to communicate? And an overemphasis on those literal words causes people to really miss the meaning.
So what would be some ways, I think those are two great examples, where a boss in exasperation is saying, "You are always late," and then the employee comes back and instead of agreeing or trying to see what is my boss saying to me and accepting the correction, comes up with an excuse. What are some ways a person can better appreciate the meaning of what the communicator is saying?
I think it's really important for people to slow down, to listen while they're listening. I know a lot of times in interactions, people are thinking of what they're going to say and what that person's going to say back and what they're going to say to that. So it's slow down and really listen.
I like what
to the
you said,
message.
listen while you're listening.
Yeah.
Because we can give the appearance, it's that verbal and nonverbal. The nonverbal can be, I'm listening, absolutely, and yet what's really taking place is not at all. So really slow down and not be defensive if it's something that's maybe hitting a button.
Right. And a lot of times when we're under stress, especially that boss situation, our tendency is to have our thoughts be racing and be thinking about what we're going to say. And we could very much miss the message and get caught up too much in the words. So slow down, listen, and ask yourself, what are they trying to express? What is it that they're trying to tell me? And that's a very important, just pause and ask yourself that sort of question. The other thing is just ask those clarifying questions. What exactly is it that you're trying to tell me? What is the problem? What's going on? And then look to history and context. There's times that I've told my children, "I've told you a million times something." Well, maybe I haven't told them a million times, but there is a context. There is a history of what's going on. So it's important to kind of anticipate and to focus on what the person is trying to say. Those are one of my favorite things. Focus and anticipate.
Absolutely. And when we're looking at the clarifying questions, let's explore an example of that. For example, let's look at the boss one. "You are always late." What would be a clarifying question that the employee could ask so that it becomes a dialogue and a communication that will improve the situation?
I think I would approach that one with a lot of caution. I think that the message to me, if my boss said "you are always late," I would have to look for those nonverbals. What is his tone? What is his posture? What is his expression on his face? And maybe it's not the best time for a dialogue, but to really kind of address the issue. Hey, I'm sorry, or I didn't realize it was going to be a problem. I think in that situation, it's pretty important to read those nonverbals and to pick up on what they're trying to express and address it in a way that communicates understanding. And way too often people argue the details of the message and lose track of the message.
Absolutely. Okay, so now as we're looking even more at communication, there are three primary forms that people use. We've got the one that we want to use is assertive.
Sure.
Right, so assertiveness is what we want to look at.
Yes.
And then we want to also look at the three forms that people can tend to use. So when we're looking at assertiveness, let's first look at what assertiveness is not.
The anti-assertiveness. And we start off, it's not aggressiveness, it's not passivity or passiveness, and it's not passive-aggressive. So do you want to handle the aggressive side?
Absolutely. All right. So aggressiveness, what we are looking at, a bulldozer is a great image to have in your mind when you're thinking about aggressiveness. Aggressiveness is the person that comes in, and probably each one of us are immediately thinking, oh, I so know someone who's aggressive in their communication. There's a lot of volume. There's a lot of intensity. There's a pushiness about it, like the bulldozer, where you feel like you're kind of being run over by what the person is saying. So aggressive is someone who is trying to accomplish what they want through force.
Yep.
And so, it's people who they may sometimes get what they want, from someone, but very often instead what they're going to get is a pushback. They're going to get someone who's frustrated and aggravated by that. Hey, you're running me over.
Yeah, now my definition of aggressiveness is where you violate the rights of the other person in order to get your point across. Mm-hmm. And I really like what you said about the pushback. Far too often people say, well, if I'm not aggressive, I'm never going to get what I want. People are going to push me over. But the vast majority of people push back. They don't like to feel like they're being pushed around, so their level of resistance goes really, really high.
It's very much that example of the animal. You corner an animal and you're going to get a lashback.
Sure.
You're going to get someone fighting. So aggressiveness is not one of the forms of communication you want to use in healthy relationships to get what you're hoping to get. So what about passivity?
Passivity, we use the example of the doormat. People walk all over you. Passive people tend to have poor posture, poor eye contact, they stare at the ground, their pace tends to be slow, their voice can be overly soft or sometimes whiny. Passive people rarely get what they want. It is interesting, people who are passive tend to be passive for a while, and sometimes they'll explode. They've sort of had enough of it, so they'll be passive. And then they get angry and overwhelmed, so their anger comes out. Passivity, a lot of times people think that they're helping the situation by being passive, but usually they're not, because there is those nonverbal signs that frustration is taking place, and also it builds resentment over time, and it really doesn't help the other person out, especially if that person is violating your rights. By allowing them to violate your rights, you're not helping them out. You're not allowing them to understand what's going on and really engage in a real partnership in what's going on.
It makes me think of, you and I were in a public speaking class together when we were in college, and we had a professor who was the model of passivity. She would, as she was giving instructions on how to give a good public presentation, she'd be looking up at the wall. She'd be looking down at the floor. She'd be looking to the left or the right of us, but would never give good eye contact. Her tone was so monotone and boring, and everything about her nonverbal and her verbal was full of passivity. So it was really amazing that we got some pretty excellent speeches from the people, because she was in no way teaching us how to do good assertive communication. So
yeah, and she was the example of the opposite. The other part, just in general about passivity, is some of the statements are just not true. Passive people oftentimes say, I don't know, or I don't care, or whatever. But in reality, that's not the truth. Mm-hmm. They do care.
They care very much.
They care very much.
Mm-hmm. Which is why sometimes the volcano. So then we've got the third one. And the third one's probably the hardest to get our minds around, but it's that passive aggressiveness that a person can have. And we have the image of a sniper, that there's a target. And I think each of us have been in a situation where we walk away feeling stung. There's an ouch factor to it, or the brain is a little bit thinking, what's going on here that I feel like I've just been sniped by this communication? So let's talk about what are some of the characteristics of passive-aggressive communication.
So by definition, I call it people getting their needs met in an indirect, aggressive way. So they're violating somebody else's rights to dignity and respect, but indirectly. Instead of punching them, they verbally assault them. They use tools like sarcasm or double entendres, where you're not really clear of what the meanings is, but you do understand that they said something that's insulting to you, or they just try to irritate you. One of the best passive-aggressive tools people can use is forget. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot it was your birthday. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to pick up the laundry. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to email you that information. So forgetfulness sometimes is that intentional, hey, I'm going to get even here.
And
So-
in that situation, it would be a recurrent, I forget. It's not the
Sure.
person who occasionally, and it made me think about you need help. The passive aggressive speaker does a brilliant job with just a fine line in you need help that causes the person walking away thinking, what did they mean by that?
Sure.
And it kind of leaves you. So obviously these are the three that we don't want to use. And there's
Sure.
three that we can easily fall into, particularly if our families used them in any way. But what we do want to use is assertiveness. Assertiveness is the best way to get our needs met. It's the best way to interact with people in all of our situations to get our needs met. So as we're defining assertiveness, what are we looking at?
You know, it's communicating in the optimum way where you express your needs, but recognizing the needs and rights of other people. So I like the example of the willow tree, that it's flexible, but it's strong and it's tall, and but it bends and it flexes in what's going on. You know, assertiveness is not weakness, and a lot of times people look at assertiveness as weakness, but it's also not pushiness, and a lot of times people look at it as the opposite, that, well, I can't be assertive because, you know, that's going to be over the top. It's not over the top. It's really looking at your pace, stating your feelings in a way that's really, really accurate. That's one of the techniques, is I statements, I think, and I feel statements to express what's going on. And it is the technique that is most likely going to get you what you want. And sometimes that's just getting the message across.
Absolutely. And this, with assertive communication, that is where the nonverbals come in. With some of the others, there's going to be a closed posture. You know, it may be the blowfish that Chandler referred to, where the person's got kind of a bigness about them, or there may be a scowl, or there may be, you know, the crossed over arms where there's a close. But with assertive communication, there's very good eye contact, and there's a relaxed posture that the person has. The tone is open. The stance is open, the gestures are open. You know, a person who's aggressive may be leaning in a threatening way. You know, a person who's passive may, you know, there's a stance and a posture. But in assertive communication, there's a fluidity in, I want to say something, I want you to hear it, and then I'm open to receive back what you have to say.
Sure.
So it's very important. It's fundamental to success in relationships, at work, in education. So what are some examples that we would want to give?
So we use a couple different techniques. In one is just the I statements, I think or I feel. You start out that way. Oftentimes, if you don't start out with an I statement, you start out with a you statement, which is an accusation. Nobody likes the finger pointed at them. So expressing, hey, I think or I feel. Appeal to authority. Sometimes there's a situation where you want to talk to the manager. You want to talk to somebody's boss. And that's an effective way of getting what you want. The other thing is, especially if somebody's tormenting you or doing things that are just irritating and they're forcing you and they make you feel pressured, it's just the broken record technique, where you say the same thing over and over again in pretty much the same words. You got to be careful that you're not being overly aggressive or passive aggressive with it. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's, you know, I really don't want to talk now. Yeah, I really don't want to talk now. Now is not a good time. No, I really don't want to talk now. And what it does is it can give you a sense of relaxedness, that you don't feel pressured on coming up with the right answer. And then the last technique is just fogging, where when people are very hostile and they don't pick up on the hints, sometimes just being very vague in your reaction. I didn't know that. Let me think about that. Really? Okay. Where it's kind of soft and fluffy, but it doesn't really engage in the conversation. You're just letting off a lot of fog. And those are some really great techniques.
Right, and I think with the fogging, there's a lot of that nonverbal that is going on. I liked what you said about appeal to authority. And I think with the appeal to authority, that's where, again, that tone is vital. It can become aggressive if you're saying, I need to see your manager now.
Yeah.
But if the tone is, may I please speak to your manager because the person, the salesperson or the customer service person is not meeting a need, and just very nicely say, may I please speak to your manager? That is very different than, I want to speak to your manager now. So, and that's an I statement that's threatening.
Sure.
You know, so again, that nonverbal is such an important component to it. But I do appreciate that sometimes we can appeal to authority.
Yeah, and this is something that I really want to stress, and it just kind of hit me as we're talking here, is that oftentimes people blame communication as the root of the problem, and it's not. Oftentimes you may say to your boss, hey, I'm working too many hours and I need to have Saturday off, and it doesn't work. And it may be that your boss is a jerk. It may be that he's got pressure on him. And so effective communication oftentimes is not the panacea that we think it is, that it is a good place to start, but it's not always the problem. So recognize that just because the other person hears what you're saying and you sent your message in an appropriate way doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to change or give you what you want.
Right, and I think that is an important part is I could have done everything in my power to communicate well, and the person that I'm communicating with is unable or unwilling to receive the message that I'm giving.
Right.
And I think the boss is an excellent example. I may be saying legitimately, look, I've got to have Saturday off, and the boss is under great pressure from his superiors and just can't. And then that's where sometimes we just have to back off and say, okay, I tried, and I may try again, and assess the timing. So as we're wrapping this up and we're looking at communication and assertiveness, what are some closing comments or thoughts?
Just a conclusion, communication is an important part of our lives. And to be careful, to really monitor what's going on with yourself, look at what are those postures and that stance and the gestures that you're using. And then also be sure to listen for meaning, that don't get too overly focused on those words because you could totally miss the meaning of the situation. And then oftentimes there is a need that when there's a breakdown of communication, either in a relationship or even in a work relationship, that consider professional help. Oftentimes a couple sessions can add clarity to those situations.
And I have found that to be so true. I have actually had some situations where someone has come in, communication has been the key element to the breakdown in the relationship. And after just a few sessions of an outside objective opinion and looking at it from a different perspective, the couple had the tools that they needed.
Yes.
The individuals had the tools that they needed to be able to more effectively communicate and to mend the relationship. So thank you so much for joining us. I think this is such a great topic.
Thank you again, and please send your comments or questions to our Facebook page, or you can email us also, and it's been a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you. Have a wonderful week.
The views expressed in this show are for general educational purposes only and do not constitute professional advice on any subject matter, nor do they necessarily reflect the views or opinions of its guests or of Independence Television. If mental health assistance is needed, please seek professional licensed treatment.